Welcome to the Math Ed Podcast. My name is Sam Otten from the University of Missouri, and I'm very thrilled to have three co-authors on the episode today, led by Gladys Krause, who's from the School of Education at William and Mary. Gladys, thanks so much for being here.
Gracias for inviting us, Sam. I'm really excited about sharing the paper with my colleagues and friends.
Yeah, and I think it's great that we do have all the co-authors here. We also have Melissa Adams-Corral, who's in the Department of Teaching and Learning at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. Melissa, thanks also for being here.
Thanks for having us. We're really excited to share a bit about, my former classroom. So today I'm going to take on both roles as the teacher, but also the researcher. It's a fun sort of bridging exercise for me.
Yeah, it's great to see the teacher in the article also be a co-author on the article. Gives a nice dynamic to it. And rounding out the authorship team is Luz Maldonado Rodríguez, who's at the Department of Curriculum Instruction at Texas State University. Luz, thank you also for being here.
Hola, de nada. Thank you for having us. And I am glad to be here with my three amigas. We've been amigas de alma for a long time, so you really get to hear our heart work today.
The article that we're going to be talking about is available now in the Journal of Urban Mathematics Education, and it's available for free to everybody. It's from volume 15, and the article is entitled Developing Awareness Around Language Practices in the Elementary Bilingual Mathematics Classroom. So with this article dealing with elementary setting and then language practices, I am just curious for each of you, how did you come to be interested in focusing on the language practices in the elementary classroom context? And Melissa, maybe you can get us started off on this one.
Sure. So in some ways, it's easy to answer this question because it was my job. I was a bilingual elementary school teacher. I was supposed to be interested in their language practices as part of my work every day. And what I found over time was that it was really important for me to understand what was going on with students' language practices, particularly when it came to defending how brilliant my students were. Their brilliance was often under attack from all sides in a variety of ways. And really understanding their language practices was a way for me to talk about how they were thinking and how they were understanding things to defend them and to point out what people weren't able to see about them.
And Luz, do you want to share what brought you here into this area of work as well?
Sure. I am a former bilingual teacher, first grade from Houston, Texas. I entered education through alternative certification. So early on, I always felt like I needed to do more learning of what it meant to be an effective teacher. My quest to graduate school started off in New York City, where I was originally in the math education department, but found my home in the bilingual bicultural department. And with the suggestion of the late Maria Torres Guzman, who's really well known for her work with dual language education in New York City, was encouraged to go into bilingual classrooms with my math questions. So that really started me on the process of understanding children's thinking as well as the ways they express themselves.
Thank you. And Gladys, how about you?
For me, it starts with the first job that I had here when I was in part of the teacher preparation program. Because I speak Spanish, I was asked to go and help a group of students in a high school classroom to learn algebra because apparently they didn't speak English and they didn't understand what the teacher was saying in the class. So I went to the classroom and I asked the 4 students to go with me to the library. And then when I went with them to work on algebra, they were speaking in English, and I thought that I had picked the wrong students. And apparently, these were the students that I needed to help with algebra because of their English, but they spoke English better than I did. So I started understanding there was something was going on with bilingual students in the classrooms, and it was my very first time in a school here in the United States. So I started working with them, and I love it, and that's where everything started for me.
Yeah, wonderful. And in this particular article, you use the translanguaging perspective I was wondering if you could just give us a quick overview of what translanguaging means and how you think about that.
It actually, understanding translanguaging actually requires understanding a little bit about past beliefs of language acquisition. Oftentimes, language as, acquiring a language was considered as, learning words, learning vocabulary. The way bilingualism looked in schools has often been what's called, subtractive or additive, depending on how children's languages. And it was often thought of as bilingual people have, their English brain and then perhaps their Spanish brain. But as the understanding of languages evolved, theories of dynamic bilingualism actually gained prominence to really understand what's going on with bilingual individuals. So it led to work in translanguaging, which Garcia and Way are some of the ones that often get cited as calling translanguaging a flexible use of linguistic resources across everyday contexts. And so the belief or understanding that we want to propose about language acquisition now is that you don't ever just have like one brain or two brains over languages. It's dynamic. And it's not helpful to think about named languages such as English or Spanish, which really vary according to where you're at, but much more understanding language practices, how you use language in context. And when we think about schooling, that's exactly what we see children doing. They're using language in a context, and what they're choosing to say or do or observe happens throughout the day. And Garcia coined a term called the translanguaging corriente, which I believe is a really nice image to think of, like a river, always there, always flowing. And that in translanguaging classrooms, or classrooms where translanguaging is accepted as the way that language just happens, looking at language practices, it's this ability for students to have free access to their entire language repertoire, and where it's just capturing, when we think about the semiotic analysis of what's happening in the classroom, right? It's not just the verbal, but it's the gestures. It's, what am I saying, but why am I saying? And that actually also really comes out in our paper, is that aspect of language practices really gives us that ability into understanding children's mathematical thinking of our multilingual students even more.
When you take a translanguaging perspective, you're also making a decision as a researcher, as a scholar, that you're going to look at students' language from the perspective that it's already doing the work it's meant to do, right? It's already working. And if we don't understand something about it, if there's something about it that's puzzling to us, then we have to think about what work the language was trying to do and whether or not that work was something we had access to or not. The whole point is for us to value the language that students are using and not to pathologize it, not to look for problems, but rather to look for all the possibilities in what they're saying and how they're saying it. And so from that extent, like a translanguaging perspective is all about communicative purpose in language. It's not about diagnosing fluency or perfection or goodness. It's about saying, like, you tried to communicate an idea and I either got it or I didn't, or this other person either got it or they didn't. It's about looking at how people use language together for purposes. And in mathematics, it's particularly interesting, right? How people use language together to build mathematical ideas.
So with that kind of robust background and perspective, can you take us into the article that's in the Journal of Urban Math Education and just let us know what was the kind of main goal? What was the thing that you were hoping to achieve with that article in particular?
I'm going to read a sentence from the paper that says the purpose of our article was to rethink the strict separation of languages during mathematics teaching. So we wanted to present examples from Melissa's classroom to share that with the field. And that's one goal. I think another one that we work on purposefully was to kind of present some historical perspective or some data on how bilingualism, bilingual education, how it has worked in mathematics education and how it has impacted in the preparation of bilingual students when they are in the mathematics classroom.
And one thing I'll add is that I think in this particular piece, as I was reading it and I was thinking about my efforts as an educator, so much of my math teaching was about listening to kids thinking and understanding how they were making sense of whatever it was we were working on and doing. And so one thing we really want people to take away from this is that focusing on correctness of language, looking for certain kinds of linguistic features or trying to get students to use them in the moment, all inhibit the freedom of language, the freedom of talk that allows us to see kids thinking. And so we want folks who read this, both from like a researcher perspective and also hopefully teachers, to understand that sometimes if we really want to focus on math thinking, we got to let go of the other stuff. And so really not trying to focus on, like, actually taking your eyes off the language in a certain sense and just letting yourself be part of that river Luz described, that corriente, can allow you to really flow with the math thinking that kids are trying to share with you.
And I would also add to that there's also a context as a math teacher educator and the shortage of bilingual education teachers. And because of the history of language and how language has often been subtractive for bilingual individuals, all three of us have found in our work with bilingual teachers that they themselves often feel they aren't sufficiently prepared for the mathematics classroom, both because of the mathematics and knowing sufficient Spanish, right? So there's belief that you need to have enough language for both. And so I think what we're sharing here in this article is this one, again, as Gladys mentioned, really trying to dissuade the separation of languages in the mathematics classroom and helping both teacher and students understand that they'll actually be learning from each other. And I think that was one of the true strengths from working in the classroom, that in Melissa's classroom, was that she really understood the students. She understood who they were, everything that they brought to the classroom. And that made her understanding of their mathematical thinking that much stronger. Understanding what students mean, even if it doesn't come out, in the proper way, quote unquote, lends itself to this message that translanguaging helps us understand.
And in the spirit of knowing the students, I wonder if you could share a little bit more about the context of the study. I mean, we know Melissa is the teacher, but maybe just give us a little bit more of a glimpse about the context, and then what data did you have that you could kind of use to fill out this article?
I can start describing when I went to Melissa's classroom for the first time. Luz was working with Melissa first, and then I started joining the classroom. And as I mentioned earlier, I went to a teacher preparation program. So I learned there that the classroom kind of had to look in a certain way, like students quiet, working, I had an image of what a math classroom should look like. So it was always, that idea was always in my head. When I started going to Melissa's classroom and we were video recording, collecting data, I entered the classroom and there was always noise, kids moving everywhere and cows. And I was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do here to collect data? What is she doing? So that's kind of the first time I entered this classroom. But then when I started listening and paying attention and really being there in the classroom, it was amazing to see how students were, the way students were engaged. Like they were, of course, there was booyah all the time. Of course, they were moving all the time. They were working, thinking, solving problems. It was a completely different community. So that's how I describe the context of this article and where this started. And then so we started talking to the kids, to Melissa, video recording, learning with the students. So that's my experience in describing the context of Melissa's classroom. I'll let you, Melissa, share more about your classroom.
So it was a dual language classroom, which means you're supposed to teach in two languages, but our school district had a rule that math should only be taught in English. So that's important context to know. I am not good at following rules in general. They make me itch, like I just can't. So that's also important context. And then the students themselves were predominantly from Mexican-American families, though we had families who were also like from El Salvador and Honduras. And then we had one student who was biracial, Black and white, and she was not from a Spanish-speaking family, but she just loved language and she enjoyed being in the space. And so that's kind of an idea of who was in there. We were in this sort of big school in the corner of a city near an airport, in a bit of a food desert. So those are kind of important contexts to know too. But I think the other piece that's really important to know is that this classroom was all about building community. Like we were always working on knowing each other better, always working on like laughing together and understanding one another. Relationships were the primary mechanism that I used to build classroom community. And that was in place before the math could really happen, right? Like the math worked, all that talking and thinking and bulla and like locura, all that was possible because the kids knew we were part of a community that like had each other's back, you know? So that's also important to know, I think.
The only additional thing I would add, right, because the context, the participants, that's the typical, research methodology. I think another perspective that's important when we're describing the context and the data is that the relationships that existed and were formed between myself and Melissa and Gladys was not your typical researcher-teacher relationship. It really was going in with the spirit of, I'm not here to observe, I'm here to participate. I'm here to learn from the students and learn from the teacher. And that was also really important to think about if we're thinking about what it means to do research in classrooms. Who is coming? What is the purpose and what is the goal? And Gladys and I we had our questions, but more important was what we were learning and letting the findings emerge from that perspective of what we were doing there, and understanding that the relationships built was one of the most important pieces to what led to a research article per se.
Yeah, and with regard to that spirit of learning from the students and learning from the teacher, I felt like that did come through in the article when I was looking at it. And part of that learning was learning from a student like, for example, the student Hugo or Ugo. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about, what his story brought to the picture. And then maybe after that, we can talk about what you learned from the teacher, from Melissa and her work and language practices in this classroom. But let's start with Ugo first. What did you learn from him? What's a little bit of his story?
So when Luz, Melissa, and I were talking about this, one of the things that we always notice with Ugo is something that Melissa highlighted a lot, and is how Ugo was always interested in learning also about us. And I was the one who, in that clip that we shared in the paper, I was the one talking to Ugo, and I always talked to him in Spanish. And I think he was always talking to me in Spanish. And at some point, I think he was trying to find ways to express his ideas in Spanish, and then that's where he starts. Like he wanted to continue talking to me, and that's how él empieza a mezclar. Like he starts. I'm not sure how to explain this very well, Melissa. I think you do a better job than I do. Like we were communicating in Spanish, but it was more than that. The way he was moving his hands, the way he was always trying to make sure that I understood what he was trying to explain to me. I don't know. It was very interesting how interested in learning about me he was, or us, when he was working with us. I'm not sure if I explained this very well to Melissa. You probably need to help me here.
I think sometimes we lose track of things as researchers. We think that we're the ones watching and observing and learning from the kids, but at the same time, they're doing a lot of watching and observing, and like they know things about us. They sort of know. They're watching when Gladys is leaning over and whispering me something in my ear when we're like working together, and they know that every time she's talking to me, she's speaking in Spanish, and they might watch me always reply in Spanish and they might learn from that. And so what we see with Hugo is Hugo knows Gladys speaks English, right? But he also knows that like, if Gladys were going to pick a language, she's going to pick Spanish. And so when he's interacting with her, he kind of like stays there with her. Even if he'd be more comfortable not staying in that exact language space with her, like he's going to stay there. And he does all kinds of interesting things to stay in that language space with her. I think sometimes we, as teachers, we think it's my job to sort of take on the communicative work here. Like I need to make sure I understand you and I need to make sure I'm explaining myself well, but kids are doing that exact same work too. Like the relational stuff goes in both directions. And so I think what Hugo reminds us is like, yes, the relational stuff goes in both directions. And then when we watch his language practices, we can see how things that he does to stay in the space don't reflect a lack of understanding or a lack of vocabulary, because he then like employs new terms that he didn't use the first time around, right? So we can see how in watching him, he's giving us the understanding that kids are watching us, they're learning from us, and they're also doing communicative work when trying to explain ideas to us. And that taking one snapshot of that communicative work isn't enough for us to sort of diagnose what their language skills are. I think those are two things that I would want to make sure we attend to with Hugo.
When we were reflecting on Hugo, to me, the entire interaction is fascinating, right? We gave him an equal sharing problem. We know the research around how powerful these problems are because students are actually making fractional partitions, and that definitely comes through. But when we focus in on the language piece, it reminds us that for all that we discuss building children's mathematical identity, often that doesn't include notions of language, and making me wonder what we're missing because we don't consider language as part of a student's mathematical identity, and how that's definitely something that we need to think about more, question more, understand how if we are separating and dictating what's the language of instruction supposed to be in mathematics, how that is effectively not allowing students to bring their whole selves into the mathematics classroom, and that it essentially silences students who are being told that you can only share in one way, right? It's a reminder to us how these policies are working counter to what our goal is in a student-centered classroom.
And then next, I want to shift us over to Miss Adams, or Melissa as the teacher in this context. What was it that you learned from looking at her language practices, and how did you bring those out into the article?
So much of my learning and involvement as a math teacher, educators, all the different hats I wear, is understanding and with this goal of how do we prepare more teachers to have the kinds of classrooms in terms of what we observed with Melissa, and finding it lacking, finding us in the colleges of education and what we're doing to prepare teachers lacking, right? We have all this research that shows what we should be doing and what children should be engaged in, but there's a disconnect between the realities and the tensions and pressures that teachers face on a day-to-day basis. And that one of the most fruitful things that came from our collaboration is the space we had and how we intentionally created the space to collaborate. But that's not something that happens everywhere.
Well, I think Luz say it better than I can say it. But what I had in mind here to say is that what we always talk about, and is that we are not preparing our pre-service teachers to be like Melissa. We want them to be like Melissa. But the reality is that when we are preparing pre-service teachers, the math education community, I don't think does a really good job at doing that. I don't think it is easy, but I think we can do a better job and learn from being a little rebelde como Melissa. Yeah, but I think it then takes a lot of courage that sometimes we don't have.
I think if we're on the teacher education point, then I might just jump in and say that, like, I think part of what worked in my classroom was how deeply relational it was. And I think that we have to think about like what things we're doing in colleges of education that inhibit relationship building. What aspects of the professor role might inhibit relationship building? What habits of class structures and course sequences and all the kinds of things we're doing keep us from relating to our students. Because I think that like that piece, the relational piece, is as important there as it is in any classroom space. And if we're not thinking about that and how our students and who they are and who their and what their language is, how that relates to their math identities and how that relates to the ways that they'll build math identities in their classrooms, I think we're missing the forest for the trees, I guess.
Yeah, and I think we're starting to get to some of these kind of summary points, broader points about the article, and that is where I wanted to go next, was about kind of takeaways from the article. I wonder if you all have had specific takeaways, having done this work together, collaborated together, and thought about this deeply. Do you have some takeaways, or are there some takeaways that you hope readers of the article will have once they've gone through the article?
This is something that we say all the time. Melissa, Luz, and I are always talking about this. And I think we wrote this sentence somewhere in the paper, and is, why are we always questioning the bilingualism of students, but not questioning the monolingualism of the teachers? And what are we doing to fix that? I think that's one takeaway that we want people to take.
I also feel like one of our consistent sayings is children are already brilliant. And it is our role as adults to understand why they aren't being perceived that way. And that drives the work that we do at our universities, with teachers, with students. With this article, one, we also get, I feel, we get typecast as we're the math ed researchers who also do bilingual stuff, instead of understanding how to teach math is to teach language. That's an everybody thing. So how do we start, all of us as a field, understanding the role of language in what we do? One of the big takeaways from Garcia's work in understanding translanguaging is, the ways in which labels are used to impact the math education that historically marginalized groups of students receive. And the term emergent bilingual, while used to really help us understand that it's about the acquiring of languages, it still serves to marginalize students. And as for this search for the perfect language speaker, which doesn't exist, right? So it's a distraction point, right? So understanding too that this is, again, if we were to look at the work of Rosas and Flores and ratio linguistics, that when we're thinking about our bilingual Latinx students, there are aspects of racism in our educational system that are coming out, and that our work is actively against that as well.
And if I'll add anything, I think that it's really important for researchers to think about what it means for them to be going into certain spaces and working with the communities that exist there. So if you're an outsider from any community, you have to think, what am I doing in my work that actually shows I have skin in the game and supporting the people in this space? And I don't just mean that in terms of like, I'm going to publish this great article that's going to make everybody think better about this. Like, sure, but like, what are you doing, right? What are you doing beyond what your university is paying you to do? What are you doing that goes sort of outside of yourself and outside of your comfort zone, to know people, to be with them, and to show them that you actually are part of what they're trying to do, what they're trying to work on? Because if not, I don't think you have the right to work with our kids, right? Like, or if our community is sharing our kids with you, like, that's a big thing. And I think we need to take that really seriously as researchers.
Right. Well, thank you very much for sharing about that work, and thank you for doing the work. And again, folks can download this already. It's in the Journal of Urban Math Education. It's called Developing Awareness Around Language Practices in the Elementary Bilingual Mathematics Classroom. Thanks for speaking about that. I do have one final question that I like to ask people, so I'm hoping to get all of you on the record. If you were not in math education as a career, and if you maybe weren't in education at all, if I can push it a little bit further than that, what might you imagine doing as an alternative career? And maybe Gladys, you can kick us off with this one.
I will be in business. I'll be doing business. I had a company, and so business.
Yeah, and if that goes well, would you donate some of the money to like teacher education? And
Absolutely. I will create scholarships for everybody.
Well, we need every business leader to do that, I think.
Yeah.
Melissa?
So I think most people who know me know that the answer is community organizer, but I'm going to say that you told me to stay out of education. And I think that anytime we're doing organizing work, it's inherently educational work. Hopefully education work, at least in my mind, should be organizing work. So if I were to really imagine like fully outside, I have this like strong desire to be a park ranger and like wear the uniform and just like exist in the spaces that everybody dreams of getting away to.
That's one of the popular answers on this podcast. I think there's been 3 or 4 people that have over the years that have imagined that sort of thing. Yeah. Luz, you want to wrap us up?
Sure. There's 2. It's hard to pick one. I think if I was going to do something beyond math education, I would become an acupuncturist because that's always been so helpful for me, and I think it'll be helpful for others. Or a barista. I've spent so much time in coffee shops working on articles and dissertations that I'd always longingly look at the barista behind the counter, not having to worry about writing. So that's another one for me.
Quite a diversity of answers, I must say. But it's good that you have this article and this work in common, but it seems like if you weren't doing this, you might all be in very different directions.
Or maybe together. Maybe I'll go and buy the coffee from Luz's coffee shop, then go camping with the park where Melissa is.
Or maybe, the business could just be to open up coffee shops in the parks.
Yeah, I would never camp there. Like I need to be in like a home with like all the amenities. Like I'm not playing with camping. That's not happening.
All right. Well, thanks all of you very much for being here and spending time on the podcast with us.
Thank you, Sam.
For inviting us.
Thanks for having us.